Good afternoon, Cinema Appreciation class, and welcome to Tatooine, the original site of Star Wars: A New Hope. And here we see the place where Luke Skywalker grew up over the beautiful setting moons and suns of Tatooine. I hope you are doing fantastically well. Today we are going to cover the topic of science fiction movies, and specifically the idea that science fiction is a reflection on science as well as our fears of where we are in any particular time period. Now, we'll touch upon the idea of horror, which we'll deal really with the next class, but science fiction and horror really do share the same fear. So when we're afraid of something in the 1920s, we make science fiction about how do we deal with that on a philosophical level, and horror on the idea of the scaring aspect that shows up. And so our fears in our science fiction movies are constantly changing based upon where science and where society goes in the future. A perfect case of this, as we'll see later on, is what do we do with films such as Planet of the Apes from the early mid 1960s, the original, not the new ones that were done in the 2000s. We were dealing with the issue of race relations. And so as odd as it sounds, and as racist as it sounds today, we were treating, when we were dealing with the Planet of the Apes, is that what happens if white people were the ones who were enslaved and African or African Americans were now in charge? Would they take the same kind of abuses on us as we did on them? And that really became the issue that shows up that people really wanted to know and deal with for the civil rights movement. And also, are we so awful, or is this just human nature that was kicking in? That was a science fiction concept that happened to be out there. So it all had to do with race relations. And that's what we're looking at. So let's take a little bit of a stroll down memory lane with some really old sci-fi and horror movie trailers, just to get an idea of what we're looking at. We're just waiting for our controls to come up. There we go. I don't know if you ever saw these trailers in the old drive-in theaters, but this is what they used to have in the 1970s, 1980s, and even earlier. Sometimes they'd play older movies.
We interrupt this program to give you a bulletin just received from one of our naval units at sea. A large object battling at supersonic speed is headed over the North Atlantic toward the east coast of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Drew Pearson. We bring you this special radio television broadcast in order to give you the very latest information on an amazing phenomenon: the arrival of a space ship in Washington. The Army has taken every precaution to meet any emergency which may develop. Just a minute, ladies and gentlemen, I think something is happening.
I came here to give you these facts. But if you threaten to extend your violence, this earth of yours will be reduced to a burned out cinder.
The robot. Without you, what could he do?
There's no limit to what he could do. He could destroy the earth. All vehicles, close in. Let's go.
And so when we look at these old-fashioned kind of images that show up, these old-fashioned images that show up, we really have to kind of consider what's going on and kind of, so think about it. That's the 1950s. We were thinking about space travel. We had never been to space before. And as we have never been to space before, or Tatooine, a galaxy, far, far away, a long time ago, we didn't really know what we were looking at. And one of the things are, of course, if we're the Planeteer, or we're the kind of inhabitants of this planet, aren't there intelligent life inhabitants on other planets? If they make it here, clearly they have superior technology because we've barely made it into space in the 1950s. I mean, that really is the beginning of the space race. And so that's one of the fears for science fiction as well as horror that actually starts to develop. And so if I share my screen again, there we go. We can see we used to have these things on science that were called Science Fiction Saturdays, all on the television. We want to look at the early versions of this because one of the most famous one of them is going to be from the movie Metropolis, which really is the thing that launches science fiction in the future. So one of the things we have to deal with is that what's the difference between science fiction and fantasy? And so science fiction, they're close. For example, Star Trek is based upon science, whereas my beloved Star Wars is based upon fantasy. And so here's the main differences over here. Science fiction is a genre based on imagined future scientific or technological advances. Note, it is imagined and based upon scientific technological advances. So that could be cloning, that could be genetic engineer, that could be the idea of solving something for global climatic change. That could be something on AI, artificial intelligence, taking over. Whereas fantasy is a genre that uses supernatural elements as a main plot element theme. There might be some science, but the science is not applied really that correctly. Or when they do apply the science and think about it correct, it's just not possible. It's so far reaching that it probably is never going to happen. So science fiction has its base in science. Fantasy is not based on science or reality. It just draws on its elements to try to make it believable enough. I mean, think about my beloved Star Wars. A long, long time ago in a galaxy far away, and they have technology that's more advanced than us. It just doesn't logically make sense in terms of kind of the development of where everything is in the universe. Science fiction describes improbable possibilities. I think this is a nice improbable possibilities, things that could happen. We could make a science fiction movie about cloning Jesus, and that becomes the end of days because we can do cloning, and we have a garment that has Jesus's DNA potentially on it in the Shroud of Turin and some other articles of clothing. Fantasy describes plausible impossibilities. And so we could have something such as, what's a plausible impossibility? Oh, that we are going to reinvent the Vikings and we're going to clone the Vikings and they're going to take over the world with their primitive technology because they're just so much bigger and more powerful than us. Probably not going to happen. That's fantasy. Science fiction deals with scientific concepts. Fantasy deals with imaginary concepts, but loosely based upon science, and that's the difference. So there's not a hard or sharp line between them, but note, it's how close to the scientific idea they are. Over here, as we look at over here, Superman, fantasy. An individual from a new world, believable. That has supernatural powers because they come because of their gravity and because of their sunlight and how they absorb energy. From everything we've seen in the scientific community, probably not possible. Iron Man, science fiction. Could we make special technological innovations to make a man more powerful or super soldier? We're already working on that, even in terms of robots. Maybe the future of war is actually fought more through Iron Man techniques. So the history of science fiction, then, here's a rough history that we'll be running through that deals with things from the future, things from the past, and kind of talks about the issues that we have. King Kong from the 1930s, monster out of Africa. As racist as it sounds, we were colonizing white people, whether that's France, England, Italy. We were colonizing Africa, and we weren't sure what animals and new things we were going to find because it was such a large, basically undiscovered talked about as the dark continent. Maybe there is a giant King Kong ape that's more powerful than any other ape you've seen, because we haven't seen everything in the deepest, darkest of Africa. Godzilla, nuclear energy actually re-empowers an individual. Alien, a dark force that we don't quite understand, is out in the universe and we come across it. The Matrix, what's the nature of reality in a place where we basically live our lives in a social media? You can see how the comparisons come across. And so the very earliest history of science fiction films are going to be these three, are the dominant three that show up. Luckily for us, we've already covered the first one, and that's A Trip to the Moon in its original painted 1902 colors, frame by frame. The beginning of science fiction, a really nice 13-minute video. It's also the beginning of special effects. Georges Méliès, it's a extraordinary voyage for its time period that brings people to different places, because we were thinking about space travel. And remember, it was so inaccurate because we had no idea what space travel looked like. Nobody was even close to having the technology for it yet. You know, we were just learning how to fly, let it go into space. So what were the audience concerns in the 1920s and 1930s? Because that's going to tell you what type of film shows up. So we call this the roaring 20s for the uber wealthy. And that is the idea, if you've seen The Great Gatsby, of resplendent wealth, robber barons, individuals getting so wealthy, the wage gap becoming enormous. Ironically, the wage gap differential in the United States is worse now, just barely, but worse than it was in the 1920s when we broke up the big monopolies. So we had income disparity where you have the uber wealthy and the working poor that are working paycheck to paycheck, if they can even afford that. We had the idea of the Great Dust Bowl, the idea that global climatic change in the 1920s was the idea that we had over-farmed our land. And so we had land that the dust, when we had a drought, raised up. And so rather than being farmland, got pushed across with these giant windstorms across and eventually into the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, depending upon where the wind was blowing from. We had long hunger lines because in the end, we're going to have the stock market crash in the 1920s. And we were starting to think in terms of going to the future. And so creating the future in some aspect. Oop. So I want to go back to that one scene and show you right there. So one of the greatest movies of this time period is going to be Metropolis. Metropolis is a wonderful movie. It comes out of Germany. And so remember, Germany we've already seen from the Expressionist movement that shows up. So we've already seen that. This is going to be called another movement in Germany that comes out of the art community as well. It's called German Futurism. They were taking, and we were so fascinated with all of the machines and everything that we were developing at the beginning of the turn of the century. And think about it, we invented submarines. We could go underwater. We were thinking about going into space. We were thinking about airplanes that could fly. We were thinking about cars. We were thinking about toaster ovens and ice boxes and microwave. We were living in a completely new mechanical machine world. And we were starting to envision the idea of computers and other symbiote life, whether they're robots or cyborgs, starting to be a part of our daily existence. We were thinking of a machine-based future. This is what the futurists were thinking about and promoting that. And they started thinking, wow, well, if there are these wonderful things, maybe there are these negative things that come out. And that is the birth of Metropolis. So it's the idea of envisioning the future. And we'll see all the amazing things that come out in terms of modern day filmmaking, such as if you really look at this, this is basically female C-3PO. It absolutely is a human cyborg. All of these mechanical features that you see all had to be hand drawn within the film itself.
With groundbreaking visuals and immense scale,
So this is the first science fiction, true science fiction film.
And you can see echoes of its architecture, ideas, and scenes in almost every modern science fiction film. But why is the imagery presented by Fritz Lang in 1927 still so relevant today? And what separated Metropolis from the science fiction films?
The entire set you're looking at would fit on a large table. It was all done with reflection mirrors.
Fritz Lang created the first serious science fiction epic.
So an underbelly of individuals that are working for wealthy people.
Also a biting social commentary of the present. So let's take a look at some of the many ways that Metropolis shaped science fiction as we know it today. Hello and welcome to 100 Years of Cinema. We'll be taking a look at least one film a year from 1915 to track the evolution of film over the last century. When Metropolis first premiered in Berlin in 1927, it had a runtime of around 2.5 hours, and although the film is revered today, it received mixed reviews at the time, with many critics praising it for its visuals, but criticizing the film for being too long and complicated. This meant that for its American release the same year, it was cut down to around 1 hour and 55 minutes. It was later cut again in April to remove all communist subtext and religious imagery. By 1936, when the film was archived by the British Museum of Modern Art, only 91 minutes of Fritz Lang's original 210 remained. Over the years, new footage emerged, but it was variations of this shortened version that the vast majority of people saw until 2008, when an almost complete version of the film was found in an archive in Argentina. This is important. The earlier, edited versions of Metropolis, seen by most people, didn't make a great deal of sense story-wise. Characters' motivations were completely erased. New cuts changed the tone and meaning of scenes, and some crucial plot points were left unresolved. For example, all reference to hell. The late wife of John Friedison were removed for being too close to the English word for hell. This made the actions of the inventor Rotwang confusing and unmotivated.
No, there's our mad scientist Rotwang.
Didn't really influence
First
how
time
we
we'd
tell
ever seen it. It
stories.
becomes
Instead,
things that
it
even Back
influenced
to the Future.
visual codes of cinema. It changed what science fiction looks like and
No,
shaped
that's
our collective
C-3PO
vision of
and the
future.
birth of kind of a
People
Terminator
were blown
culture
away
later
by
on.
the vivid world built by Fritz Lang.
A
The new
mechanical
Tower of
culture.
Babel standing
No,
tall
we
in
have
the
buildings
city
that
of
look
light,
like that today.
starkly contrasted with the dark,
Look where the poor
subterranean
live.
workhouses of the poor. The film's architecture itself is as much a character as Rotwang or Maria. If you removed all dialogue, action, and characters, you would know everything you
Note
needed
still
to
the
know about
angular
the world
shapes
by looking
that
at the
is a
buildings alone.
reference
The
back to
busy
German
highways and
expressionism,
bike lanes
the
convey
earlier
a sense
film
of
movement coming
urgency
out of
and
Germany.
speed, and show us the interconnectedness of a city of the future.
So those
While
are
the
all stop
unknowing,
motion
uncaring
cars
machine
as well.
of a subterranean city tells us we're in a world where industrialization has been taken to its logical conclusion, where human beings are expendable so long as the wheels keep turning. The buildings and architecture alone tell us that this is a world
Look at where the
it's a
wealthy
life of
live
bliss for
compared to
some
the
and
mechanical
drudgery
world.
for others.
And they live
these
above
symbols
ground, we
and
live
visual
below
codes
ground.
would become
We've seen that
written
even in
into
the Matrix
DNA
of
of
Zion.
cinema. You can see it pretty much straight away in films like Just Imagine from 1930, which tells the story of life in 1980 New York, complete with skyscrapers, hovercrafts, and an interconnected city, bridges and highways. Metropolis's iconography in an industrialized future, where workers act as cogs in machines, would later reappear in 1936's Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. In more recent movie history, Metropolis has influenced the look of iconic science fiction films, including many of the images from Star Wars, from the characters, props, and even cities. Perhaps the film most heavily influenced by the look of Metropolis was Blade Runner. Replace biplanes and blimps for hovering police cars, and you have something pretty close to art director David Snyder's vision of 2019's Los Angeles. Other ideas from Metropolis would also reappear throughout cinema. The mad inventor Rotwang served as the inspiration for James Whale's Henry Frankenstein in the 1931 Universal movie. Completely humanoid robots would be seen again in movies like AI and The Terminator. Not only did Metropolis create the visual grammar for how we see the future, but by combining futuristic Art Deco cityscapes infused with Gothic religious symbolism, including a fight on top of a church, it helped influence the dark tone of fantasy in films like Tim Burton's Batman or Alex Proyas' The Crow. But why is the imagery of Metropolis so enduring? For one thing, the film plays on our fears of the future, a future of industrialization.
And that's what science
where
fiction is
workers have been
supposed to do.
dehumanized. And this is
And horror.
reflected in what you see on screen. Vast rooms of uncaring machines. It's a future of inequality, where the working class live in drab, subterranean structures, while the ruling class live in a clean, bright city. But it's also a future of hope, of amazing technology, of bright lights and new possibility. And it was in Fritz Lang's combination of these things that changed the way that we see the future. Thanks for watching 100 Years of Cinema. What's your favorite film set in the future? Let me know in the comments below.
So when we look at this and actually talk about the idea of the transformation and all the special effects that are going into Metropolis itself, we've got to think we have the birth of the modern day kind of industrialized city where the wealthy live at the top and the poor live at the bottom. Now, this is not something new, but it was the first time we had actually ever seen this kind of depiction in on film. We had the idea of the machine aesthetic and really starting to celebrate robots, cyborgs, going all the way into Terminator and RoboCop in the future. We have the idea of the mad scientist, which even in Back to the Future is going to be Doc. And so we see all of these kind of wonderful things that we look at today without a problem. It's also the idea of this dystopian future, whether we see it in the Hunger Games or in Divergent, where you have the wealthy ruling the poor and their labor and almost forcing them like slave-like labor using machines within that process. So here's one of the most famous scenes from Metropolis. This is Maria's special transformation. Now, Maria was chosen because A, she was so beautiful, but also she's of the lower class. She's a lower class teacher that wants to teach her students that they have aspirations to become the upper class, which this movie almost does not allow. It almost makes fun of people transitioning from one to the next, unless you're like Maria and really beautiful, and a man would find you attractive and bring you up to that next level. So they basically want to make sure that her message doesn't get across. So they clone her and basically turn her into a cyborg so she can, and then keep the real Maria for themselves, the beautiful Maria, but send the unbeautiful Maria, or I'm sorry, still the beautiful Maria, that's the cyborg, back to teach them that, yeah, our class is a really good class. So here's that scientific transformation. And note, this is basically the basis of Frankenstein. Without question, this is Frankenstein. And there is the doc, the crazy doc. Note, anything that is animated is literally hand animation. You know how we create an entire mad scientist studio that we will still use as a trope today. Note, those lines are all animated, that they had to be hand drawn as they move around one another. So there you can see the outfit for Tron that we're going to see later on in science fiction film. Right? And then a beautiful dissolve, one of the first uses of a dissolve. There we go. So now we've sucked the life out of this Maria, who of course will come back to life later. And that's what we're looking at. So as we get into the 1930s, rather than science fiction, except for the Frankenstein, which is kind of a combination of science fiction and horror for the way that it's depicted, but not really our actual science fiction horror movie. It doesn't come until Alien much later, about 30 years later or 40 years later. We really go into the Hollywood genre of kind of the monster movies that are coming out of MGM. And so we're going to get Frankenstein as science fiction, largely because it's based upon science. It's talking about reproducing individuals, reanimating people. And we were, let's face it, that's where our science was at the time period. But what happens if you bring someone who died alive again by resuscitating their heart? Were they close enough to death that there's a monster capability that comes out of it? This is still a concept we deal with today. How close to death can you be before you actually are really dead in a zombie?
Is turned loose to strike terror into the hearts of men.
So this is one you could argue is either science fiction or fantasy. We are right on the
Shock
cusp.
women into uncontrolled hysteria. Elizabeth! To prey upon the innocence of children. This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions.
Frankenstein, the book, was only written less than 100 years before this.
Don't touch that!
So it was still pretty new in the concept. Now here they're selling the idea of it being more horror itself to try to get people in, particularly for 15 to 35-year-olds to go see it. Another thing that shows up, and this is a hard watch, this is a film that the studios have all tried to ban because there were a number of science fiction movies that came out talking about the idea of what we would call freaks or circus individuals today. For those of you that know American Horror Story, we actually had an entire season that was based upon the freak culture in a circus and what would take place. And so as much as Hollywood wants to bury this, I have found it actually. So this is a movie clip that appears on the internet and then quickly disappears. It's a movie that's actually called Freaks. So it's from 1932. The studios want to bury this, as you'll see, of the negative depiction. And some of these are actors, and others are actually individuals that really do have these various afflictions. And she felt like an outsider, even though she was beautiful in normal society. So they're willing to accept her into their society, but she's got to take and be part of the fiendish behavior that sometimes takes place. So this really does not celebrate them as freaks. It kind of makes fun of them. And that's why the studios have so much trying to hide these in the modern day world. So by drinking it, will you get what they have? And so it's all about the kind of making fun of the freak show of people with deformities that show up. And this has been buried for a number of years. So in the 1940s, for both science fiction and later on for horror, we are going to start doing these things, as you can see from the various kind of images here. We have Roosevelt's third term, but we really are going to get involved in World War II, develop the atomic bomb, and that is literally going to lead us into the 1940s and 1950s, including Big Bang Theory. So we are looking at energies and the release of energies and powers that have impact on life that we just couldn't fathom even a decade before. And so, no, we're going to have, because of the 1940s, we're in World War II, we're not going to develop a lot of science fiction in World War II. We're basically going to continue on the same tropes that we saw before, building upon Frankenstein, Dracula, all the earlier monsters, because it's escapism. Those people that are not over in Europe in World War II or out on our fleet fighting the Japanese for control of the Pacific Ocean, they don't want to think about war when they go out. We really want to use it as an entertainment industry. Whereas if you went to Europe, they were dealing with the issues philosophically in very kind of Italian neo-realist type films or neo-realist films about the situation in war and what it meant. We wanted to escape from that reality. And so in the 1950s, we were eventually going to join in another war, Korean War. We're going to start with medicine. So anything that comes out of medicine, the idea of Brown versus the Board of Education, that's separate but equal is not the same. And so we're going to integrate our public school system. We're going to develop kind of the idea of African Americans starting to challenge the idea that they deserve rights, particularly coming in the aftermath of World War II, where they were able to serve very distinguished, such as people as the Tuskegee Airmen, and help out the fight for the cause. And then, of course, we have we have communism coming to our world, and that communism actually is going to scare the hell out of us. And so with this, we start to create science fiction that deals with some of these new modern issues. Think about what Invasion of the Body Snatchers is. Individuals from another society come in and infiltrate us and slowly take over. We're dealing with communism, right? The McCarthy ages of self-censorship where you couldn't be a communist was considered absolutely terrible. The Day that Earth Stood Still talks about an alien race coming in and having more power than us. Why? We were starting to think about getting closer and closer to the stars, putting up Sputnik, trying to figure out if there were alien creatures that were smarter than us within the world that is. And of course, the hallmark one is Godzilla in 1954. What are the impacts of dropping a nuclear bomb on a population and on a fauna and a flora that we knew nothing about? And so that's the point of Godzilla. Electronic radiation.
Once a city of 6 million people. What has happened here was caused by a force which, up until a few days ago, was entirely beyond the scope of man's imagination.
Let's have it, Steve. What about this monster story of yours?
Well, it's big and terrible. Now he's making his way toward the city's main line of defense. 300,000 volts of electricity strung around the city as a barrier.
Later, of course, we come to find out that Godzilla is meant to protect the Japanese population, right, from the wonderful or terrible force that we now have of nuclear war.
Now it seems Tokyo has no defense. I'm saying a prayer, George. Prayer for the whole world. Steve Martin signing off from Tokyo, Japan.
So again, that's all on the impact of nuclear weapons. We're going to get crazy kind of things that show up. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes from Radioactive Tomatoes. We're going to get Attack of the 50-Foot Women. these crazy kind of different that shows up. And of course, when the communists start to attack, we need a way of understanding how dangerous they are. So we come up with Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
We can tell these fools I'm not crazy. Make them listen to me before it's too late. Listen to me. Please listen. If you don't, if you won't, if you fail to understand, then the same incredible terror that's menacing me will strike at you!
Think about the nightmare that threatens the world. They're really talking about communists here in a horror film genre. Or I should say science fiction film genre. There is a horror element that shows up.
Spawned in the light years of space, unleashed to take over the bodies and souls of the people of our planet, bringing a new dimension in terror to the giant super scope screen.
Whatever intelligence or instinct is it, driving the forming of human flesh and blood out of thin air is fantastic.
No, we're going to build upon this later on. Movies like Relics.
A cursed, dreadful, malevolent thing was happening to those he loved.
This isn't just an ordinary body, is it? I never saw one like it. It looks unused.
The sensational star discovery of A View from Poppy's Head. And now an undreamed of horror makes her life and love a vortex of fear.
Where do they come from? I don't know. Suddenly, while you're asleep, they'll absorb your minds, your memories. I don't want any part of it. You're forgetting something, Miles. What's that? You have no choice.
From city to city, an incredible historical panic spread. As the unimaginable becomes real, the impossible becomes true.
Stop and listen! Listen to me! You're not human! Can't you see? Everyone! We're here already! You're next!
The communists are here already. You're next. And no, this is the time period when we're fighting Korea, fighting in Korea for the control of the Cold War to see whether it's capitalism and democracy or communism that's actually going to be what wins the day. And we have an entire process that shows up that deals with McCarthyism and literally basically making sure that people that are communists are silent so they can't have an impact on the larger population. It's seen as that detrimental. Then we get into the ripping 1960s. The ripping 1960s, we come back here, the peace movement, the love movement, the Beatles, space travel, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, feminism, Vietnam. It's one of the most tumultuous time periods in all of American history. The sexual revolution always takes place here as well. And what we really do get fascinated with then is one, it's going to be race culture, right? Planet of the Apes, which we talked about before. If African Americans had the same power and technological advances as white people had during slavery, would we have basically had a reverse slavery that would have shown up? Would African Americans and Africans taken the same advantages? And it's dealing with that issue. And what do we do? How do we deal with it today? Can the two species on some level, and they're not even species, remember, we're talking about the same species, African Americans, white people, or Africans and Caucasians. So really what we're talking about is, can we even coexist in the modern day world? And before that, we get to lovely 2001: A Space Odyssey, which in 1968 for science fiction is really the year when real science fiction takes off. So look at the opening of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's one of the greatest openings in all of history. Now, everything that you see has to be invented because we do not have space travel yet. So here's the opening. It's a Kubrick film. So just like 2001, where we start off with that orange and that blue, we're going to start off with a color that centers us. And beautiful classical music as well. J cut of sound coming in first. Just darkness is just, oh. And look, we have the moon lowering, and we see we're on the dark side of the moon. Thank you, Pink Floyd, later on. we're coming up to Earth with the sun rising over it. So we've just seen the Earth rise rather than the moon rise or the sun rise. So we're supposedly in a spaceship on the other side of Earth, potentially coming home. And this is all amazingly done with a ball, and that's just a desk lamp, and everything else is blocked out. So it's called 2001: A Space Odyssey. So it means we're in space, we're in the future, and what we are using as primitive technology to make this shot is anything we ever do. Remember, an odyssey means a long voyage, an arduous voyage going back to the Greeks. So we are ready. Let's go see some space. Let's go see some tools. Let's go see the modern advancement of the human spirit. We are kind of awesome. And the next scene then, ironically, is us as monkeys. Pre-evolution that would actually take place. So it's a real challenge because we've got 15 minutes then to get to space from evolutionary history, and we explain it through these monoliths, like that new information that we saw before in 2001: Space Odyssey when we talk about thematic editing. Whenever we see these large black monoliths, those black monoliths in front of us, we have to determine, is that our human mind really expanding and exploding, or is that some outside inspiration like a God force coming to drive us along? God helping us change ourselves from the animals, become much more in the more morals phrase, or is that an outside world? Now, one of the reasons why 2001: A Space Odyssey is magnificent is because Stanley Kubrick, who is the consummate artist, literally everything that he wants in a shot is going to be in a shot, or he'll redo the whole thing again, over and over and over, sometimes driving people crazy. Shelley Duvall in The Shining didn't act for 4 years after The Shining because she was so messed up with what was happening, with really going through psychosis. Because what happened is Stanley Kubrick had her shoot some shots 30 and 40 times because he didn't get exactly what he wanted. So he literally is inventing space travel. No one had ever seen how any of these things work. He worked with NASA scientists to try to figure it out, and this is what he came up with. And note how freaking accurate it is, even by today's standards. That's what makes it remarkable. Note we've seen that shot in many a Star Wars movie. Planet being passed by a floating object. And watch how lyrical he makes it using classical music. That's a model with the Earth. Again, it all has to be invented. And there's just our simple light. All right, so most people are going to figure this out. There's these things floating in space, lack of gravity. It's that he figured out the next part, which is amazing. Look at that beautiful cut in then. Show you the Earth and the moon. This is what was really fantastic. So in order to have gravity function, you kind of have to have a rotating body so that people will stay in orbit. And no, they don't get sick within it because they're rotating at the right level for gravity to hold them up. And so he's just inventing all of this. And he invents basically the way space travel really looks. Note the ship here. That's pretty close to the Space Challenger, right? A reusable ship that kind of looks like a plane with a nose. It's a little bit more angular, but again, they were doing this 30 years before our space program. Even note in space, the idea that everyone has to be buckled down. Look at the floating pen, beautifully added in here, just to give you a little detail. And the flight attendant, of course, if there is a flight attendant, has to be able to move around. So look at the beautiful rack focusing here. You go from the pen to the flight attendant, and the pen almost disappears. So you see the reflection there. She's got her anti-gravity grip shoes on. Now we go to rack focusing where everything is in focus. Note how close to the Columbia it looks now, or the Space Challenger missions. Note how the two have to sync up and catch up with one another. That's how space docking actually works. There's generally rotating objects, and each of these rotating at a different range, which no one had really ever thought about before. So we worked with NASA to make sure that this was accurate. Note the IBM computer right there, which we need for space travel. I mean, even the thing about the TV, which we take for granted in the back of an airplane, no one had ever seen that before. The TV was brand new. Note this is basically the docking bay of Star Wars on one of the Imperial starships. And so he's basically inventing the future here. It's pretty amazing. We're also going to be challenged, as I mentioned before. So here's a slave raid. And note how eerily similar this is to probably slave raids that took place from the 1850s, except that it's mounted gorillas, representing the African population if they were technically ahead of Caucasians with guns. This is the first film that won Academy Award for costume. Costume was not even a film, or was not even a category, and they petitioned because it was so good that they started the category basically because of this particular film. Falling like a Christ-like pose. And then later on, of course, in this movie, they're going to find out one of the white people can actually speak and actually has language. And so it questions the intelligence on whether they are actually fully human or not, which is exactly what we're looking at when we look at racism and how we make assumptions about individuals that looks just like us. And don't think that people early on didn't think that racism was bad and didn't understand the difference. Most people love their children. And so if you're willing to give your children over to someone else of a different color that you love to raise and to breastfeed and to actually teach, then clearly you know that racism is wrong, because otherwise you're not going to give your child over to someone else. So it's not like we didn't, we just justified it. And then in the 1970s, we're going to go through a tumultuous period as well. But what's going to happen is space is really going to become the idea. And the 1970s are a fairly violent time period. So we're also going to go through the Clockwork Orange and talk about how do we make people less violent? If we actually expose them to violence, a lot of violence, can we condition them so that they think violence is disgusting? So science experiments on individuals That's what Clockwork Orange really is about. And so our first sci-fi horror, the true sci-fi horror, rather than Frankenstein, comes out in the modern day world. And this is the one that establishes the tradition, a great trailer. And of course, this is Alien, one of the great trailers of all time. So this is the birth of sci-fi horror, the combination crossover that we have all over today. Right, it's not scary just for the cultural north, but your life is really in danger. So we have a desolate planet, we think. Note the low-key light being developed by Citizen Kane here. We're also going to have a lot of backlighting that shows up as the monster chases us. And one of the most famous scenes in all of film, of course, is when the alien emerges from the body that only a few people on set knew. So we'll watch that during acting because it shocks the hell out of people when they see that scene. They're not ready, so they're reacting naturally. You also get a little bit of the sexuality coming out in the aftermath of Psycho. Right, you can see Sigourney Weaver almost naked a couple different times in space with a great tagline, maybe the greatest tagline ever in film: "In space, no one can hear you scream," which starts an entire franchise as well. So that's the birth of science fiction, or the birth of actually the crossover between horror and science fiction. And the question becomes, if we do come in contact with one of these aliens that's dangerous in the future, what do we do? Do we kill off an entire species, even though it is a new species, like in terms of science? Do we risk bringing it back to the United States, or actually the United States in this case, or to the world, when it could wreak havoc and kill individuals for the sake of science? What do we do in that particular circumstance? And then the great opening we've talked about in Clockwork Orange. Also science fiction, dealing with the idea of violence. If someone actually is so conditioned with violence, and also there's a huge amount of drug use that takes place that makes people more violent, what do we do with those drugged individuals that literally are hopped up on whatever, cocaine, methamphetamines, heroin, that they're really hard to control? Is it okay to actually train them, or is there a way of training them out of that violence? Or also, do we need to lock them up and throw away the key? Note, in the 1980s, in the aftermath of this explosion, that's exactly what we do. We come up with mandatory minimums for drug addicts, and we basically throw away the key and lock them up because we don't know how to rehabilitate these individuals. And we basically have the same policy in our prison population today. Though we just outlawed mandatory minimums just 5 years ago. And when we do that, of course, we've disenfranchised a whole population of African and Latin Americans, and their prison population exploded. So we've basically done harm on the communities because we did not know how to treat drug abuse. Also, there's the idea of sexual objectification. Remember, this is feminism that's actually going to be on the rise here. And here there's clearly no feminism. In fact, rape is one of the major crimes they're committing.
There was me. That is Alex. And my 3 droogs. That is Pete, Georgie, and Dim.
The idea of the peace movement, as you see here on the left, the hippies, versus the military on the right, which we saw numerous conflicts in the 1960s and 70s over. Black Power movement on the right versus the military on the left. Again, we saw
This
all
would
those in the
sharpen
1960s.
up
So we really are talking about the society.
ultraviolence.
And they were getting ready. They were looking forward to ultraviolence. And so how do you do that? So what do we do with the 1980s? 1980s, a timeline. No, we're going to get first artificial hearts. So the idea we're starting to create individuals that aren't fully human, getting to that cyborg kind of Terminator type aspect, even in the idea of RoboCop, right? We are in the 1980s. We're going to create another cop based upon a cop that died using artificial parts. We're going to start having new technology to find Titanic. We are going to get new diseases. So we're going to get epidemic movies like Outbreak that are going to start to develop. We're going to have Wall Street crash. So the idea of losing all your money, not being able to afford anything. And of course, we're going to have internet and other things that are going to start to develop. So we're going to be talking about time travel. We're going to be talking about genetic engineering and potentially other predators from around the planet being able to attack us. And so sci-fi from Back to the Future, is this sci-fi or fantasy? That all depends upon whether you believe or how accurate believe the idea of Einstein's scientific principles, that we basically live in a loop that is not continuous on the timeline, but it actually is kind of like Interstellar 20 years later for Christopher Nolan.
Marty leads an ordinary life. No fly ever amounted to anything in the history of Hill Valley. History is going to change. And 1985 is not his year. But Dr. Brown is about to change all that.
Are you telling me you built a time machine? Not a DeLorean?
He's sending Marty 30 years back in time.
It's a flying saucer from outer space!
Now he's trapped in the past.
This has got to be a dream.
About to meet his future father.
He's amazing tough. Wow!
And he's making an impression on his mother.
You can have those dreams. And you can sleep in my room.
Maybe you do can have serious repercussions on future events. Now he's got to make his mother and father fall in love.
To find out, I haven't even been born yet.
And only Dr. Brown.
So no, that comes out of Metropolis, crazy scientist.
You told me to just sucker it.
Michael J. Fox. Christopher Lloyd.
Plans for me in the future, so all of your gravitational pull.
To the future.
Which is okay. And this is again one of those that straddles the line right between science fiction and fantasy, depending upon which scientist you ask. The 1990s, of course, is going to be the rise of the internet and genetic engineering, the idea of what's real in the social aspect. Terminator, can we send people back to the future or forward to actually solve problems in the past? I mean, think about the interesting, there was one thing that could have, or one event that could have changed world history. Would you go back and fix it? There's a scenario during World War I where an English soldier has a shot on Christmas Day, ironically, to shoot Hitler, not knowing who Hitler's going to become in World War II. And he doesn't take the shot because it's a poor man on Christmas looking for food, and he just ushers him back to the front line. Think about how that one event could have changed history, particularly for the Jewish people who basically are down to half of their population after World War II and Hitler. And so we have ramifications, and that what are those ramifications? So by going back in time, Back to the Future started to bring up those issues as well. So one of the most famous one is, what is real? Coming out of the Matrix series, particularly the first one. Do you live in a completely created computer-based world in your room and don't see the outside? What is the access is real? But also, how do you know when you go outside it's real and the computer screen is not real? How do you know that in the world where we live in, you are not exactly what this scene says, a battery, because we now know the brain is filled with electrical impulses? How do you know that's just not you?
Welcome to you. As you no doubt have guessed, I am Morpheus. He's not a magician. No. The honor is mine. Please, come. Sit. I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. tumbling down the rabbit hole? You can say that. I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate, Neil? No. Why not? Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life. I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? Matrix. Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window, or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
So here's the question for all of you. You know something's wrong with the world. Which pill do you take?
After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland.
And one of the great shots in film history. Look at how that's edited. That's not how the glasses would see the world, but the idea of being in Morpheus's mind and Neo having a choice here.
All I'm offering is the
beautiful shot right there. Extreme close-up on the intellectual. Which would you choose? Do you want to know the truth, even though the truth might be miserable? Or do you want the idea that pull the wool over my eyes and let me live a happy life, even if it's not real? And so that's what we're seeing when we're looking at the Matrix. So the idea of the nature of what's real. We also have the idea of the opening of race relations and cyborgs that show up in Terminator. The idea of not just going back in space, but are these powerful individuals?
In the 21st century, a weapon will be invented like no other.
Right? Think about this, the human weapon.
This weapon will be powerful, versatile, and indestructible. It can't be reasoned with. It can't be bothered with. It will feel no pity, no remorse, no pain, no fear. It will have only one purpose: to return to the present and prevent the future. This weapon will be called the Terminator.
You're dead, honey.
What day is it? The date. 12 May. Thursday.
What year?
I'm here to help you. I'm Reese, DN 38416, assigned to protect you. You've been targeted for termination.
What does it want me? Why me?
Arnold Schwarzenegger is the Terminator. Your future is in its hands.
Right, we have the idea of the perfect weapon that comes up. Basically what we have later on with Iron Man as the weapons manufacturer that's showing up. And then a re-release, of course, that shows up. So we're looking at kind of these other things that happen out there. Of course, genetic engineering with Jurassic Park. We're also starting to clone sheep such as Dolly. So why can't we do with dinosaurs and other things from the past? Steven Spielberg's epic exploration of genetic engineering. And ironically, this is what I almost went to college for. I was studying chemistry to become a genetic engineer and fell in love with African art.
Capture the imagination of the entire planet.
The most phenomenal discovery of our time becomes the greatest adventure of all time.
Can I touch it?
Sure.
We saw this film earlier, one of the 100 greatest films of all time. One of the first films to make $1 billion. The special effects are remarkable. The aesthetics, it won a number of of effects. And also one of the most famous introductions for exposition scenes, talking about how they did it through, that we saw when we talked about the Freitag exposition scene.
Back online. 65 million years in the making. Jurassic Park.
So note, all of these are based upon the idea of science fiction that kind of in the modern day world, but also fears we may have as things develop. And so in the 2000s, what are some of the issues that came up? All right, we have Iron Man, the idea of weapons manufacturing. We have the idea of WALL-E, the idea of kind of rooting our own society, whether that's through global climatic change, whether that's through war, and trying to have to repopulate the city through the idea of kind of the idea of men. So one of the great Pixar and Disney animation is WALL-E, which really deals with what happens if we screw this world up so badly we can't live here, and the robots that we need to fix it. So note, all these are contemporary issues that are actually showing up from each time period. And note, we generally don't leave that. So all the issues we had from the 50s with nuclear weapons and power are still here today. We have a remake of Godzilla. So once we develop a problem, we now have all sorts of different problems. Probably why we're so anxious today, right? We're dealing with all the issues from the past and all the new issues that tried to solve the issues of the past. We have all of them today. So imagine in 50 years how anxious the human condition could be. Look how realistic this looks compared to anything we've seen in animation up until now. We had our animation lecture last time.
Wow.
So the idea also, can robots fall in love? Can they have the same human emotions and relationships? And later on, we're going to see what humanity has done. We basically are slovenly individuals laying around and can barely move on our own. So We're just waiting for the Earth to re-heal itself with these robots. All those issues that show up. Then we deal with the idea of the modern day mind. We are starting to untap the idea of the modern day mind that shows up. Guardians of the Galaxy, probably much more on the fantasy side. The Avengers has some characters that are fantasy and some that are really based. We have Captain America, while his exploits are overly ridiculous and more in the fantastical realm, we do genetic engineering experiments and don't think that other nations are not doing that with their soldiers. We clearly are within that realm now. We have Iron Man as the weapons manufacturer. We have, Black Widow, who's being trained to be an assassin from a very early age. It can do superhuman things. And we have Thor, which is more on the fantasy side. So we have all those things together. Think about Inception, though. The idea of uncovering and unlocking a mind and be able to plant a memory in someone's mind so that they actually remember the world in a different format. That's a very realistic thing that we do. It's actually how your memories are formed.
I specialize in a very specific type of security. Subconscious security. You're talking about dreams. Mr. Cobb has a job offer he would like to discuss with you.
We got work placement?
Not exactly. You create the world of the dream.
No, Dr. Strange is going to borrow this technology as well.
And they fill it with their secrets.
Then you break in and steal it.
Well, it's not strictly speaking legal. It's called Inception. Already. I think I found a way home. And this last job, that's how I get there. Dreams feel real while we're in them. It's only when we wake up that we realize something was actually strange.
It's your responsibility. You're not prepared for this.
Trees collapsing. Have it under control. I need to see out of control.
An excellent way on where science actually leads us today. And so if you can think of, and this is what we'll do in class, come up with 10 science fiction movies and discuss the scientific theories that show up. Remember, you're looking for sci-fi, so the separation for you and the argument you're going to have is what's the difference between sci-fi and fantasy? If I'm telling you Star Trek, sci-fi, Star Wars, fantasy, Harry Potter, fantasy. So where is that line? And can you come up with the scientific theories and the ideas behind 10 major science fiction films, of course, that we haven't already covered today? And that will be what we do. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye.